So in this talk, we're going to be focusing on Louis Sullivan as both a theoretician and a practitioner. And we're going to begin by kind of looking at the work he did, the kind of experimentation, the dabbling with ideas that are happening up to the point where he writes Kindergarten Chats. And then in his case, he takes a kind of pause in his career. And at that point where he's writing Kindergarten Chats, we're looking at the buildings he's doing at that point. And in particular, looking at how they exemplify the notions, the ideas that are in Kindergarten Chats. But if you're going to talk about Sullivan, you can't help but start with Richardson. H.H. Richardson was by far the most distinguished American architect of the 19th century. In 1876, at the centennial of the country, they had a poll among architects to see what were the 25 most important buildings in the first 100 years of the nation. And I think like 12 of those 25 buildings were Richardson buildings. He was so admired in that era. And as I mentioned in the last talk, Sullivan would have been very, very familiar with Richardson from age 16 when he was at MIT. So if we focus on Richardson for a moment, that building, Trinity Church, would have been literally 2 blocks from MIT, so that he would have walked by this building all the time. It would have been completed just before he began architecture school at MIT. And this would become probably Richardson's most famous building. So Sullivan was very much inspired by Trinity Church. He also would have known those buildings just down the street at Harvard that were by Richardson. He did a number of buildings there. This one is Seaver Hall. And really, what you need to be seeing in these buildings, and it's a little hard for us to see with our 21st century eyes, but this was the Victorian era. Buildings were all about being incredibly ornamented and tons of claptrap and a zillion little moves everywhere. And Richardson was all about simplifying, smoothing that out, getting it down to simpler geometries. And that's very much what we're seeing in Seaver Hall, a simplification of traditional architecture. He also was, before there was a term for it, he was a functionalist. And Sullivan kind of codified that, but he really learned that notion of functionalism to some extent from Richardson. This is one of Richardson's libraries. He did a bunch of libraries. But you can just look at that building and you can read every function in the building. So beginning with the entrance, which is very, very visible here. And then if you're going up to the upper level, the stairwell would be very clearly marked there. The entry hall, marked by that gable. On one side of the entrance would be the reading room, this lovely little space where you could curl up with a book, and it's grand and beautiful inside. And on the other side would be the stack space with the books up to a certain height, up to kind of reaching height, and then clear story windows up above that. But the end of the hall, the little nooks of books on either side, the vertical circulation, the entrance and the front hall, and the reading room, all of them very articulately described in the building. So it's functional in that way, but also functionalist in the sense of the technology it was made out of. It was made out of a relatively soft stone that was common in the area, but then adjacent to the more vulnerable parts of the building would be a harder stone, one that would be more durable, where you begin to have exceptions in the wall. So again, he's ornamenting the building in a way with things that are functional. And that was a new idea. One of the more mature of the Richardson buildings that would have again had a huge influence on Sullivan. Sullivan, as we know from the last talk, moved to Chicago. Shortly after he moved to Chicago, Richardson did this building there, which is the Marshall Field Warehouse. And again, it's just really simplified. It's just those masonry walls with arches that carry the loads down, all of those modular through the building, and just as simple and clear an expression of a warehouse building. very simple structure, very regular. This is what it's about. It's just a big storage facility. Its function is expressed in the form of the building. And for the time, an extremely reduced, simple, clean kind of building. Now, what does Sullivan take away from that? He's there in Chicago. He's seeing the Marshall Field warehouse down the street as it's being built. This is his hero building right there in his hometown. And the first building that he really does under the firm Adler and Sullivan is the auditorium building, done in 1889. Now, you would have noticed that that was 1885 when the Marshall Field warehouse was done. Just a few years later, Sullivan gets his shot, as we mentioned in the talk last time. Young guy, still in his 20s. He gets this partnership with a well-established firm in Chicago. They get major commissions like this. And he's looking down the street at Sullivan, and really very much of the Marshall Field warehouse is borrowed in the case of the auditorium building. So he's got the smaller arched windows turning into larger arches, turning into larger arches as it goes down. The heavy rustication at the bottom, getting to be thinner and lighter and more refined as it goes to the top. Now, this is not a warehouse building. And in fact, it's a very, very complicated building programmatically. It's got offices all the way around and up in the tower, but all of that is surrounding an auditorium, the sort of major performance space for Chicago, with the fly loft here, the auditorium there, and then actually very cleverly surrounding all that by offices, so that an auditorium wants a big blank wall. They don't want any light or air or view or windows. So why waste that frontage in the city? Why not let the offices get the light, air, view, and then bury the auditorium in the center of the block, as he did right here. So it's a very, very innovative plan for a building. That articulation owes a great deal to Richardson. I would say at this point, this is a young architect not quite finding his legs. He's doing a lot of borrowing, but he's borrowing from good sources, and he's understanding it. But this is not a building particularly driven by theory. It's driven by, I can kind of see what I like and what seems good here, and I know bits and pieces of why it is that way, and that's developing the auditorium building. This great tower at one point, offices up through here. Actually, that was Adler and Sullivan's office up at the top up there. And then after they split as a firm, that was Sullivan's office until he died. Again, that very, very clear material change of rusticated stone at the bottom. Heavy, massive, rugged kind of stone. What Sullivan would have seen as Western. This is not prissy New York stuff. This is Western Chicago kind of roughness. And then above that, it gets a little more refined, and then finally gets to be lighter, thinner as it gets higher, and less loads are there to weigh on that stone. Inside, he's developing a kind of Sullivan attitude, especially about ornament. Very much inspired by nature. This is, as we talked about last time, Thoreau, Whitman, these appreciations of American natural environment. And again, he's out in the West now. He's not in the urbanized East Coast. And very much the ornamentation being inspired by vegetation, sometimes even specific and local vegetation. So the character, the ornament of the building, it's not about classical ornament. It's not about traditional architectural styles. It's about the toughness and ruggedness of that stone. It's about the inspiration of form from nature and natural forms. And that's really shaping the building. Shortly after that commission, he gets the commission to do this office building in St. Louis, the Wainwright building. This is it right there, that original Wainwright building. This is an addition to it done by Aldo Jergala later. And that building is really the beginning of an exploration of the office building. And again, this is a guy who talks about form follows function, and he's thinking, what is the function of an office building? It's this repetitive kind of module of rooms. And so its expression as a building should be this repetitive module of elements. But that would be different on the bottom, where it would be retail down there. And it would be different at the top, where there might be mechanical equipment and other kinds of services that were required up there. So it begins to say there's a bottom and a middle and a top, and that portion in the middle that is really about the function of offices is this very regular repetition of units of office space. Now, it also is on a corner site, so this side of the building and this side of the building are on that corner, and then it's L-shaped to get as much light into those offices as possible, and eventually becomes U-shaped with the addition. And there you can see the differences between the retail on the lower levels and then the offices up above in section. Now, how it's made is meant to express again something about how it's built. It's a steel frame building, and he has to coat that steel. The Bessemer process had been developed a few decades before. That made steel way, way more possible as a building material. But steel at 1200 degrees Fahrenheit begins to slump. So you have to protect it. You have to fire protect the steel so that it can't reach that 1200 degrees in a fire, or the whole building kind of gives away. So they were beginning to figure out what later became code, but he's actually sheathing that steel frame in masonry to fire protect it. But instead of it looking like a normal masonry building where the masonry would be the areas over the windows, instead he's very clearly articulating that steel element here. And then this becomes a lightweight material, terracotta, which is not brick, is not structural, and reads just as a kind of infill element there. And then it's the terracotta, which is actually clay that is formed and shaped and baked, and therefore can be articulated any way you want, so that becomes the more nature-inspired ornament. And then the steel frame is expressed in those strong verticals out of, with the fireproofing of the brick around the steel. Again, in close-up you can see all of those surfaces articulated by references to nature or references to geometry, the two things that he felt like were authentic sources of architectural ornamentation, not this kind of claptrap classical vocabulary that more traditional architecture had. After he finishes the Wainwright building, he then gets a commission to do a very similar scale building, similar function in Buffalo, the Guarantee building. This one was done in 1894. And again, you can see that frame of the steel, but now he's even saying, you know, I'm going to express this whole thing as skin. This is not going to be structural. When I use the brick, it started to feel a little like masonry and structural. So now I'm going to express very clearly that all of this is just fireproofing surface that I put around a steel frame inside it. And all of that skin is articulated with this very crusty surface of the terracotta. Again, it's a U-shaped building to get light into all of those offices. Again, the base and a midsection that's the repetitive office elements, and the top. And then this really incredible tour de force of terracotta, where he's articulating all of that with this either geometry or natural form-based ornament. Very repetitive because they made terracotta in forms, so you make one form and do it over and over again, and that would create these modeled surfaces. But again, made to be very clearly skin and not structure. And that was true inside and outside the building, with this very highly textured surface throughout. And the variety of those is kind of daunting. I mean, the guy is a designer like crazy. He's making many variations on a theme. And then the third in this series of buildings that are exploring what is an American, Western, Chicago tall building. And in this third one, it's not an office building anymore. Now it's a department store. So the department store in his mind had a different module than an office building. These are back in the days when department stores needed lots of natural light coming into them. They didn't want to close them up from the outside. Women wanted to see the color of that dress in natural light. So there are many, many windows all along here. And you can see the kind of regularity of those windows expressing the kind of big open floors of the Carson Peary Scott department store, but in a completely different proportion and module than you saw in the offices. And then there is that major entry point here to the department store. The bottom floor is getting a different articulation because they had some communication directly with the street than the upper floors of the department store there. And now he's really making it very clear this is a steel frame. And again, the sheathing is terracotta. It's just a big, simple, regular plan like that with 30-foot bays. And then the big windows in between those structural columns, as you see there. All of that is then sheathed in rather flat terracotta with just a little bit of texture in it. And then at that entry point, all hell breaks loose. And now it gets much more exuberant, and it has all of that sort of vegetative ornament, and now in cast iron instead of in terracotta at that entry pavilion. So that is really taking this notion of a steel frame, and he's exploring it in a number of different ways, in Wainwright, in Guarantee, and then in Carson Peary Scott, thinking through what is a frame, how do I express that on the outside of the building, what's the difference between a department store and an office building. And again, this is a relatively young guy who's cutting his teeth on experimentation and learning these ideas in rather large and important buildings in Chicago. So at the same time, he's doing some smaller projects. And in this case, this is the Charnley House. It was in a very nice neighborhood when it was built. Now it's kind of downtown Chicago, right in the center of the city. But again, comparing it to other houses of the time, Victorian houses of the time. So this would have been a few years before, let's say, the Littlefield home here on the UT campus. Very much Victorian era. But this is very pared down. This is not that crazy, florid, exuberant, look how rich I am, Victorian architecture that you could see all over in Boston. You could see all over in New York or Philadelphia. Wealthy people building these great piles of Victorian ornamentation. In the Charnley House, Solon steps back, he simplifies, he says this is something that's kind of Western frankness, as he referred to it. And to our eyes, still pretty exuberant, but in the era, very, very much a kind of calmed down version of a wealthy family's house. Very simple plan where you go into a reception hall, big rooms on either side that look out to the street there, or it's got a very interesting corner lot. So there are two streets that intersect here, but that corner lot, the street jogs, and that becomes the axis of a street parallel to this one that comes in at a different angle. So there you can see the Charnley House, which becomes actually a building on axis with the street that emanates on one side, then the street jogs and goes, and it becomes having an address on that street. Very simple stone, very simple brick. When you go to the inside, and this is where, damn, I love the interior of this house. It's got ornament and character, but it's so pared down and so elegant. There certainly is pattern in that mosaic tile fireplace there. There certainly is pattern in these balustrades, which are really beautifully crafted, sawn pieces of wood. The molding is all very, very thin, very light through the whole thing. This beautiful stairwell with the slats of wood. But again, thinking of Victorian houses in general, this era, and the kind of simplification that's happening on the interior as well. Beautiful light, beautifully proportioned rooms. Now we're seeing this guy as a very clever, very capable designer, but beginning to have a direction of his own very different from what he would have been accustomed to on the East Coast. This is a house that Sullivan did for himself. He had a vacation home in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, living in Chicago where it's cold, cold, cold in the winter. And interesting that as a young man, he became successful as an architect, and he made a lot of money. And so he had his summer house, or his winter house that he would go to in Mississippi when it was cold in Chicago. Quite a nice and kind of gracious house, but anything but pretentious. Very simple kind of house, big screened-in porches on the front there, a little guest house off to the side, because he'd be inviting his friends to come down from Chicago to escape the winter as well. There you can see it in the era when he lived there. These were pictures I took of it in the, 1990s. It's actually gone now. It was Hurricane Katrina took it out, and it has not been rebuilt. But again, not only about this simple kind of unpretentious house for someone who now has a fair amount of money, but it also is speaking to where it is. This is the southeast with a huge pine forest, and everything's made out of wood, and so the house is made out of wood shakes, none of that masonry or brick or the kind of thing you'd associate with Chicago or with Boston, where he came from, really responding to the local vernacular, much deeper eaves, deeper shadows, the big screen porches, all of those things responding to the climate, the sort of regional materials, the character of the place that was there. And there's that simple little guest house adjacent. Now, I want to make the point of Richardson is beginning to express something that might be thought of as American, as different from European or traditional architecture. Then Sullivan follows that with his house that he does in Mississippi. And you can see those simple roofs, those deep eaves, the big openings, the welcoming kind of open sense to the building. And then you can see that being transferred on to Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, worked for Louis Sullivan through the 1890s. He actually worked on the Charnley house to some extent. And at the end of that time, he was moonlighting and doing the Winslow house right here. So this is Frank Lloyd Wright in the period when he's working in Sullivan's office. And you can see Wright borrowing from Sullivan and appreciating the kind of work that he was doing there in Ocean Springs. So that house became the transfer, and then very shortly after that, Frank Lloyd Wright leaves Sullivan's office and takes off on his own practice. So at this point, we find Sullivan in the late 1890s. He's had a 14-year partnership with Dagmar Adler. It was a great partnership, but there were not always easy times there. Dagmar Adler was an older generation. He was very interested in a good business-like firm. Sullivan was much more interested in design, much younger. And at a certain point, they split after 14 years of partnership. At that point, in 1895, we see Sullivan kind of turning to an introspection. And he becomes maybe more of a theorist for a while at that point. This is when he starts writing these essays that get collected into kindergarten chats. So he's thinking and he's writing and he's contemplating what's important to him about architecture. And for the rest of this talk, we're going to just kind of focus on 6 points that he makes in the book, and then look at how they play out in the buildings he did, especially in the mature part of his career. These are really the points we're going to want to discuss when we're face to face and we have our discussion period. So I want you to think really clearly about these 6 points. How did he get there? Does that make sense? How did it manifest itself in his work? Is that convincing? And then also, is this an idea I'm interested in personally? Or was that, a long time ago and it's irrelevant now? So let me read, and I'll be referring to this handout that you received, which is notes on kindergarten chats. And this is something you should definitely bring to class, print it out probably, and be able to refer to as we have our discussion in class. So Roman numeral 1 there on those notes is about architecture as an expression of cultural values. And Sullivan says, nothing more clearly reflects the status and the tendencies of a people than the character of its buildings. They are emanations of the people. They visualize for us the soul of our people. Wow, that's like astounding. Do you believe that? That architecture really expresses the soul of the people that produce it? Another quote, he says, to project architecture as a projected life of the people is a serious business. It removes architecture from a petty domain and places it where it belongs, an inseparable part of the history of civilization. So if you think of architecture this way, this is not a lighthearted thing. This is not something just taste in the mouth architecture. This is profound. This is important. And that's definitely how Sullivan sees it. So he says architecture is up there as an expression of a culture. And then Roman numeral 2 here, he talks about architecture as an expression of American cultural values. So now we can get a little more specific. And he says, I would dissolve for you the wretched illusion called American architecture. That is, all of what's going on right now, he wants to dissolve that. And then cause to awaken in your mind the reality of a beautiful, a sane, a logical, a humane, living art of your day. An art of and for democracy. An art of and for the American people and your own time. So the goal is, if architecture is an emanation of the culture, then what is our culture? What is American culture? What is democratic culture? And that's really what architecture ought to be expressing. And he is very much, here's where he just gets foaming at the mouth, angry about this pretentious, look how rich I am, stylish architecture. He says the mire of materialism is not American civilization. It is Gomorrah. This is not democracy. It is madness. It is the growl of the glutton hunt for the dollar. So that to him is not America. That is not democracy, all this pretension. That's just, that's decadence. And so he's looking for something that, as he says, is seeking out the simple. Seeking out what is the architecture of the everyday life of America and everyday Americans in his era. So That's kind of corollary to that first point. And then the third point he makes is on these notes is the idea of architecture as an expression of regional culture. So it's not just about America, it's about what part of America you're in, because America is very diverse. So he makes the point that he's looking at a particular building and he says, this building is, to be sure, not characteristic of the West. The West for him is Chicago. We'd call it the Midwest now, but that was the West in the United States at the time. It utterly lacks Western frankness, directness, crudity, if you will. It is merely a weak-rooted cutting from an Eastern hothouse, and it languishes in the open air. So he felt like, okay, maybe that effete architecture of the East Coast, that expresses that crazy decadent society there. But out West, we have a kind of directness, a kind of frankness, a kind of crudeness, if you will. And the architecture ought to have some of that spirit to it. So let's look at a few buildings he did in exactly the same period when he's writing these things, and see how that might be playing out in some of his buildings. This is a bank that he did in Owatonna, Minnesota. So when he broke from Denkmar Adler, he wasn't the greatest marketing guy, so he wasn't getting these huge commissions in downtown Chicago. But instead, he went to sort of ordinary Midwestern society that he loved. And he began to really build for these small communities in rather rural areas in Minnesota and Iowa and Illinois, the Midwest. So this is a bank in this little town of Owatonna. And now we got to think a little bit about banks in that era. Totally different than we think of banks now. Banks were not mega corporations. Banks were local. They had to do with really the financial stability of a community. And having a good bank was super important for any kind of small town. The banks generally lent money to the entrepreneurs, whether it be a farmer or whether it be a retailer. They lent money to the entrepreneurs. That allowed the entrepreneurs to start their business and to keep the business going season after season if you were a farmer. And then you repaid the bank. And the bank was always owned locally. It was not owned by somebody from outside. This was a local kind of civic institution that was essential in this notion of rugged individualism, of everybody standing on their own 2 feet and having their business, having their farm, having their operation. So the bank gets this kind of civic quality. It's on the main square in Owatonna, and that piece of it is the main banking hall, and it just says civic. It says this is an important institution in our community. And then there's a portion of it over here that turns into retail and then has offices for the bank on the upper floor. But really it's, again, expressing its character and its role in that community. In that big room, which is right there, it's subdivided and has all the tellers and the bank officers around in kind of open plan around there in these partitioned areas, but then has a big grand room with a skylight at the center that really is the focus of the banking hall. It's made out of, again, good Midwestern brick that's ubiquitous in these small towns in the Midwest, and then a little bit of vegetated ornament that actually has to do with vegetation in the area. A friend of mine, Harwell Hamilton Harris, did the restoration of this bank and went back and traced really what plants he was bringing that from, and they tended to be good stock Midwestern plants. This is the inside of that banking hall. There's a sense of importance and kind of civic grandeur, but then it's all about being in a rural area. We've got murals of the cows, this fantastic mural of a farmer doing his work on the farm. And you really get this sense of this is what Midwestern America was about in that era. The individual running their farm, the bank lending them money, this institution that really became a heart of that community. So he does that in Owatonna, Beautifully, beautifully made building. He does that in other communities similar to it in the Midwest. This one in Grinnell, Iowa in 1914. And again, always this sort of big banking hall with nice light coming into it, almost making a religious building of this, something that has spiritual quality to it. And this celebration of the manger entry portal there. And that's what that looked like in plan with the grand hall and then the bankers and tellers on either side. That big celebration of the front. And this, the vegetation that now creeps around on the building. These actually, I think, were added later. I don't think that's part of the original. I've seen drawings without them. And then this is a third one, the People's Federal Savings and Loan Association in Cedar Rapids in Iowa. This one I very much love for that notion of thrift. What are Midwestern American values? It's about thrift, and that becomes embedded in the building. And what is a bank? It's about money, it's about finances, and thrift is a fundamental value embedded in those finances. And then all the way down to tiny little bank buildings, this one in Columbus, Ohio. But a number of these that are really about what does it mean to be American architecture and to just forget European styles. No classical columns, no pediments. And banks in the era all over were classical banks. They looked like the Parthenon. And he said, no, that's bullshit. Let's find something that really is about this locale, about its vegetation, about the kind of civic nature of what this institution does, about the farmers, about the cows, about the place, and it really is an emanation of its culture. Now, this is something that had been embedded to a large extent in Richardson, and this Richardsonian Romanesque, which is he produced in some of his buildings, then got to be extremely popular all over the Midwest and all over America. Courthouses in Texas were done in this Richardsonian style because it was deemed to be American. It was not some European style you could put your finger on. It was really American, and it had emanated from the US, and it became the prevalent kind of vocabulary for civic buildings in America in the latter part of the 19th century. Then Sullivan himself, when he's doing a very important building in his career, the transportation building at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1892, he again tries to make something very American. In that instance, many of you probably know this, the World Exposition that was done in 1892. This was commemorating the 500th anniversary of Columbus discovering America. And so it was a huge thing for Chicago to get this World's Fair. But then when they actually started to build the fair, the architects who were in charge of it decided to do what they called the White City. And it was a Greco-Roman pistache. I mean, it was just full of plaster replicas of Roman baths and Roman fora and Roman temples, and it was all perfectly white. It was a complete kind of fantasy that had nothing to do with Chicago, had nothing to do with America, was a replication of classical styles from Europe. Sullivan was furious about all of that and about these architects that were involved in that. They threw him a bone and gave him one building at the fair, and he did it exactly the opposite, not like all the rest of the buildings at the fair. But what he saw to be as something that was open and light and airy and simple, and none of all that heavy fake stone claptrap Roman building that he was seeing around. So again, he's saying we need to make a Chicago building here. We need to make something that's about the openness of our society, and not like we have an emperor or worshiping Hadrian or something here, which is a complete fake. So it was really that Owatonna Bank, I think, that he's crystallizing that idea and he's putting it into architectural form. And really, that's our point in this class. How does theory really inspire architectural form? So let's look at a fourth point that he makes that are in the notes here. He talks about an inspiration from nature. And he says the faculties always cleanse and brighten in the glow of nature's bath. There's something about nature that gets into you pretty deep and stirs you up and brings all sorts of strange emotions to the surface. So he saw in using these natural forms a way of creating a kind of emotion in a building that was fresh and authentic and sustaining for human beings. So we see that in some of the work of Richardson, where he's beginning to make ornament that is inspired by natural forms. But it really comes in spades in Richardson in all kinds of ways, in metal sometimes, as we see here, in terracotta, as we've seen in many of the buildings, but almost always inspired by these natural forms. So again, in our discussion in class, what is the appropriate inspiration from nature? I mean, does architecture have anything to do with nature? Is it in fact something that cleanses and gives architecture a kind of breath of fresh air and makes it sustaining? If so, is this an appropriate way to use nature in architecture? So in class we'll have a discussion about that. A fourth point that he makes and is recorded in the notes here is the notion of form follows function. And we've talked about that a little before. Let me read you the famous quote that started the dictum. He says, "So remember and bear ever in mind in your thinking and in your doings that form ever follows function, that this is the law, a universal truth, that the main function, so far as you will be concerned, will focus on the specific needs of those who wish to build, and that such needs are quite apt to be emotional as well as what is generally called practical." So this form follows function, and again, this has been dumbed down to and misinterpreted as, oh yeah, that's just straightly functional. But I want to make the point that he says at the end of that sentence, these needs are quite apt to be emotional as well as what is so generally called practical. So yes, it's practical function, but it's also emotional needs that are being met by the building. So his notion is that just as we see in nature, something like, he says, the form horse expresses the nature and the function horse. The form hand expresses the nature of what a hand does. The form oak tree expresses what the nature of an oak tree is and how it functions. Form follows function in nature, and we should be making buildings that do the same thing. So again, this is something that the idea starts with Richardson. And here you can see the Stoughton house that Richardson did in 1882. And this would have been a house in Cambridge that Sullivan would have known. And again, if you take the typical building of the time, this is so different because it really is generated by function. By understanding how you come in on the porch, you move into a reception hall there, you move upstairs sweeping to the bedrooms up above, but at the lower level you can go, if you have, generally the women went to the parlor right here, the men guests went to the library right here. If you're having a dinner party from the reception, you go to the dining room right here. If you go to the dining room, then after dinner you adjourn the men to the library, the women to the parlor right there. Of course, off the dining room, you have what would be the butler's pantry, or the place where you would store your china and silverware and all of that. You have the kitchen where the food is prepared. So the servants are able to come and go in the back, prepare the kitchen, prepare the food, send it to be plated in the butler's pantry, move to the dining room to eat, and all of the servants' activity would be restricted back here, and the guests would be out there. It's beautifully shaped around function. And then the expression of the building, you can read that entry so beautifully. You can read that stair that takes you to the second floor. You can read the difference between the bedroom with its smaller window on the upper floor and the living room with its larger window on the lower floor. Throughout the house, it's really form follows function. And that's true inside as well, that sweeping stair that takes you up to the bedrooms up above. Very different nature of the room for the men, the guys' room, which is all woody and what was deemed to be masculine at that point, and the parlor, which was a very different kind of character. This was in Richardson's work all the way through. This is the Glessner house he did a few years later. But it's always these forms, the stair having its own expression. This is the dining room down below that has its own expression. Again, functionally, all of those rooms, the stables, the kitchen, the dining room, the living room, all of those things really agglomerating by function. And that was true in Richardson's libraries, like we looked at with that kind of entry hall there, the book stacks on one side, the reading rooms on the other side, a separate form for the vertical circulation. That plan of Richardson really inspired Sullivan, who in his plans, this is the Babson house. Again, each function gets its own kind of articulation and form. That then goes on to inspire Frank Lloyd Wright in his plans, where he strings out the rooms and makes individual expression of different elements within it. Here, one of his most famous houses, the Roby house, where you get a form for the living room, you get a form for the dining room, you get a much less dominant and recessive form that becomes bedrooms, kitchen, more utilitarian functions. Function begins to drive what architecture is in all of these. And that's happening, of course, in Owatonna too, where we get that major banking room having one kind of expression. And then on the side, as I mentioned, the retail spaces on the lower floor and the offices on the upper floor having a completely different kind of expression. So form follows function, certainly a major, major point in the theory of Louis Sullivan. The sixth and final point I want us to look at in these notes is on materials and tectonics. So he says the materials of a building are but the elements of earth removed from the matrix of nature and reorganized and reshaped by force mechanical, muscular, mental, emotional, moral, and spiritual. So he makes the point that the materials really are where we find emotional expression in the building. And we need to think of the materials very much as an element in architectural expression. And he makes the point that, in older times, when you had the master builder, they would actually physically be putting together the materials, and that would be an expression of what they were doing. Now, we don't physically, as architects, put those materials together, but we have to have such a connection with those materials that we can feel what they're like, and we can design so that they have the kind of emotional content that comes really from knowing those materials and feeling their weight and their character very, very strongly. So this would have been Richardson in the county courthouse in Pittsburgh. This is Sullivan taking that same kind of really rugged Western frankness and expressing it in the auditorium building. A very different thing when we're using brick, or where we're using tile, or where we're using cut stone. All of those things having their own expression. As we talked about earlier, that notion of the steel frame. How do you deal with that steel frame? How do you express it in the nature of the building? But for Sullivan, this is essential in making architecture. You get expression from an understanding of materials and structure. And again, that's coming in Carson Perry Scott, where he's exploring that even further in terms of the steel frame and how different that is from an entry portal that is not a part of that regular frame, where something completely different can happen. Okay, this is, all of these are just elements of the theory that Sullivan is, in his mature life, laying down for everyone else to read in kindergarten chats. But it really is the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of quite a long career at that point of building. And then you can see it expressed in these newer buildings he's producing and how literally they depict these ideas in physical form. So in our discussion, we want to look at those ideas. We want to look at where they came from, whether they're authentic now, whether they're authentic, whether they were authentic then, whether they're authentic now. Did he manage to get those into the building and to make architecture with them? Are there elements of those ideas that might be applicable today or not? So hopefully you will think about all this, write your think sheet, and then come to class prepared to have a really rich and interesting discussion with your own perceptions about this. Okay, see you.